One of the reasons for taking part in direct action is to get a story onto the TV news. The following news and current affairs stories are of action stage to get a message across to the general public. This tape has been put together to enable activists to assess the relative effectiveness of various tactics and how TV news journalists have responded to various situations. We recommend that you pause the tape at the end of each segment to discuss each action. As well as the relative effectiveness, you might also wish to discuss the safety of the activists in each situation.
The USS Blue Ridge is the command ship of the United States 7th Fleet. As such, she's the command and communication centre for approximately 50 other ships, 450 aircraft and more than 60,000 personnel. Fortunately for Tasmania, this visit is strictly friendly.
So we hope by these visits to be able to emphasise to everyone the close working relationship we have with the RAN.
Included among the Blue Ridge's 1,000 crew is a contingent of Marines, and judging by today's performance, their reputation as America's fighting elite is well deserved. The Marines say the mystique is hard-earned.
We like being the best at what we do. You know, we strive really hard to be the best at what we do. It's kind of goes back to pride, I guess.
While in Hobart, the Blue Ridge's crew will be doing much the same thing as other first-time visitors to the state. Some travelling, some partying, and just soaking up the atmosphere.
Australia is very beautiful. I love the way they talk, the accent, and I've just had the time of my life so far.
Just do some sightseeing, touring around, mix and mingle.
I'm hoping to find a Tasmanian devil. You've heard so much about him. We have a cartoon character about one, but I've never seen one.
The USS Blue Ridge will be open to the public tomorrow.
Of the US warship Blue Ridge. Here to commemorate the Coral Sea Battle of 1942, the ship docked regardless of the protesting kayaks, squeezing some of the tiny craft against the pier.
As the USS Blue Ridge steamed into Sydney Harbour in this morning's brilliant autumn sunshine, its officers and men could be sure of one thing: there would be a reception. The waterborne protest by the anti-nuclear demonstrators had become as much a ritual for visiting American warships as the raising of the flag. While the ship moved very slowly down the harbour, the protesters were coordinating their assault by radio.
I'd estimate that you'll catch sight of it rounding Bradley's Head in 10 minutes, possibly less. Over.
Okay, we're all ready on this side.
Then, just as the tugs moved in to berth the Blue Ridge, so did the first of the protest fleet, dodging the escorts. In this traditional battle of tactics, the Blue Ridge was being brought in stern first. No point here in clinging to the ship's bow, and those who tried to cling to the stern found it wasn't that easy. The water police were using fire hoses on the protesters, but others engineered their own dunking. As always, the US was neither confirming nor denying nuclear weapons were on board. Demonstrators claimed that, as the amphibious command ship of the 7th Fleet, the Blue Ridge played a pivotal nuclear role. And as it pivoted towards the wharf, some of them were too slow. Police made no arrests, and the US Navy didn't seem too disturbed.
2 demonstrators were arrested after managing to hoist a banner on one of the vessel's masts. It was the second day of protest against the ship, visiting to commemorate the Battle of the Coral Sea.
The Battle of the Blue Ridge was on again today. While protesters demonstrated outside the gates of the Garden Island Naval Dockyard, at least 10 of their group had managed to board the ship. One eluded security to plant a banner on the ship's mast, and there he sat for an hour, defying the combined might of the United States and Australian navies and indeed the police. 2 of the protesters who boarded the Blue Ridge claimed they were kicked and punched, not by the Navy, but by Australian civilians visiting the ship. One was a girl of 14.
Okay? All I'm saying is that no one on that ship gave me any assistance, okay, when this guy was getting stuck into me. No one would help me, okay?
I was actually hit in the jaw by a woman who was trying to kick other members of our peaceful protest.
The protester who'd climbed the ship's mast was eventually brought down, disdaining the offer of a safety harness. He and another man were taken from the dockyard in separate police vans. It was the second day of protest against the Blue Ridge. Yesterday, water police turned fire hoses on demonstrators in kayaks who closed in on the ship while it was berthing.
How did the Hobart and Sydney stories differ? How do you account for this difference? What do you think about this protest?
For ignoring efforts to protect the Antarctic from pollution. An expedition found a large rubbish dump surrounding a Soviet station on the frozen continent and the wreck of an Argentinian supply ship wallowing in the seas 1 year after running aground.
It's the largest wilderness area on Earth and the most fragile. While nations argue over Australia's proposal to protect the continent from exploitation, research stations operate with little scrutiny. This is what was found by Greenpeace around the Soviet station at Bellingshausen. An embarrassed Soviet officer first refused to accept the collected rubbish, but after the cameras were turned off, agreed to load it onto a supply ship returning to the Soviet Union. Even worse was the discovery of the upturned Argentinian ship Bahia Paraiso. A year ago, the ship ran aground, spilling hundreds of thousands of litres of fuel into the ocean. It lies there still, with 250,000 litres of fuel still on board, slowly leaching into the sea. In October last year, a meeting of nations in Paris agreed on a strict new code for disposing of rubbish.
It shows that the foreign governments are talking about changing the way they're impacting Antarctica, and yet they're not really changing how they're operating in Antarctica.
Another meeting of Antarctic nations will take place in Santiago around September. This could be the last chance for Antarctica to be recognised as a wilderness region by the international community.
Greenpeace often supply their own footage rather than depending on getting media to attend a protest. This is especially relevant if the problem is as far away as Antarctica. What are the advantages and disadvantages of activists supplying their own video? And what did you think about the use of music in this piece, or Greenpeace's video of the base and the banner on the ship?
Follows a raid by Greenpeace on the Port Kembla steel plant.
As dawn breaks, 8 Greenpeace Zodiacs leave the Rainbow Warrior in Port Kembla Harbour, bound for BHP's iron and steel plant. The environmentalists had marked out 5 drains flowing into Allens Creek they were determined to plug. Every day, up to 1.5 billion litres of steelworks effluent pours from the pipes into the creek and the harbour. Among the discharge, with the approval of the State Pollution Control Commission, 16 tonnes of oil and grease, 4 tonnes of ammonia, 62 kilograms of cyanide and other toxics. The effect on marine life, a fishing ban in the inner harbour until the year 2005. The first Greenpeace plugging went smoothly, but was a diversion. As security men tried to deal with the situation, other Greenpeace members began to plug 2 of the biggest pipes further down the creek. Greenpeace are now trying to block these 2 pipes which they say are emitting more than 200 million litres of toxic waste every day. But as Greenpeace struggled with the pipes, company executives and police arrived. On a rocky hill, confrontation. And then, BHP's admission. Is BHP breaking the law with its discharge?
BHP at the moment is discharging cyanide above the level set by the SPCC.
Would you agree that the situation currently has gone on for too long?
Yes, I think it has. And we have to do something about it.
The admission doesn't come as any surprise to the Pollution Control Commission. It concedes it's known BHP's been breaking its licence for more than a decade and describes the licence as more a goal than a limit. Now BHP is promising a new plant will reduce the emission of cyanide and other toxic material within 2 years.
Greenpeace activists with boats and uniforms plugging drains. Boosted by nuggets of hard information, they succeed in getting a confession from the plant manager. What did you think about this protest?
Hunters claimed the protesters were endangering lives when they raced hunters to the fallen birds to take them to an on-site vet.
6 a.m. at Lake WANNAMAL, the official start of the duck season. Hunters waded into the water to shoot. They were outnumbered by conservationists ready to rescue the birds.
We have a recipe here for disaster and for loss of life, and the liberationists seem to believe that they're above the law and above every other thing that's going on.
Conflict was unavoidable. It was a repeat of what's happened in Victoria.
Oh, of course we're worried about this. We're in a dangerous situation. There's two groups of people here, both with violently opposing views. One is to save the birds and one is to kill them, so you can't get more opposite views than that.
It ended up being a race for the injured birds. The hunters say their ducks were stolen. The conservationists say the birds were saved.
They're not meant to take our ducks to start with. We shot them, they're our ducks. But there were so many of them out there, they got them before we could bring them in.
At least 25 birds were rescued, only one was an endangered species. The hunters were furious.
It's totally out of hand. It's ridiculous. This is the most amazing circus I've ever seen.
But then again, so were the conservationists.
Well, if we hadn't have been here, today would have been a bloodbath.
The conservationists say they'll be out on the lake as long as the hunters keep shooting. Duck season lasts 4 weeks for the state's 3,000 hunters.
A story of stereotypes, the hunters being mostly men and the protesters mostly women. What effect does the following statement have on you?
There's two groups of people here, both with violently opposing views.
What do you think about this action?
Called in after demonstrators breached security overnight and painted graffiti on Naranga's ray domes. Today, 180 protesters were arrested when they breached the security area.
The unpredictability of events in this protest reached unprecedented levels about noon with the arrival at Woomera airfield of 50 soldiers and 22 Australian Protective Services personnel. The troops were ordered into the area after last night's en masse breach of high security when 9 demonstrators made Australian protest history by invading the Naranga facility. And why the need, Brigadier, to bring them in?
Well, we take the security of the joint facility very seriously. And it has been breached, and obviously we need reinforcements, hence the troops and the police officers have come up with me.
Protesters say they were active painting slogans for up to 15 minutes before detection.
I climbed up the ladder to the top of the tower, the radar tower, and there was some pumps and electrical boxes and so on. And I opened the electrical boxes with in mind switching off the radar and actually closing down Naranga for a short period of time as a symbolic act.
At first light today, more than 300 demonstrators were again in action, cutting fences, challenging authority and testing the patience of security personnel. About 80 swarmed beyond both buffer gates, penetrating more than 3 kilometres and to the very heart of the Naranga facility.
Communications base at Naranga in South Australia's far north. 219 anti-base campaigners were arrested, taking the total over the 5-day protest to 492.
A touch of levity as protesters bared a symbolic face of defiance to authority signalled the start of day 5 and the final assault on Naranga. The last day of demonstrations had produced the biggest rally of support yet. More than 400 assembled in readiness to storm Naranga en masse and to take control. An Aboriginal elder of the Kookatar people made his contribution to this campaign.
You got a bit of paper?
Hey?
You got a bit of paper?
You look at the banner. The Munda is my Munda.
Respect from both sides of the fence for the elder was obvious. He was allowed to walk unhindered and was not formally arrested. But his was the last concession. The arrest rate of the past 4 days doubled in the following hour at the hands of the federal security guards at the main gate before the media and state police at the base itself. The final act of this 5-day demonstration is being played out down the road about a kilometre away at the Naranga facility. Ironically, the only outsiders privileged to see the top-secret base are the protesters. 3 television journalists arrested for trespass yesterday were not permitted to enter the region today and will lodge complaints to the Department of Defence.
A humorous start with the lead taken by the Aboriginal elder before calm arrest, followed by a few scuffles. The media also make a protest about the restrictions on their actions. What do you think about this protest?
One woman suffered a broken arm when about 70 demonstrators clashed with police over the export of yellow cake.
The enthusiasm of anti-nuclear demonstrators has not abated as shipments of yellow cake from the Olympic Dam mine continue. The 6th shipment, worth about $24 million, arrived at the Port Adelaide docks about 1:30 this morning, to be greeted by another rowdy protest. Demonstrators linked arms to stop the convoy, and the 16 police on duty started dragging them away.
Get the hell out of it!
But they quickly returned. Although there were no arrests, tempers were frayed. Kate Barrett, a member of the Green Party, was stunned by the incident. She was treated at the scene and later taken to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Today she was nursing a broken arm.
I am angry at police, and particularly, in fact, the fact that they didn't take any notice of my condition for about 10 or 15 minutes afterwards. But my main anger is really at our government for allowing this evil mining to go ahead.
Ms Barrett will lodge a formal protest claiming excessive and unnecessary force with the Police Complaints Authority.
Police violence often becomes part of a story when direct action is involved. It can easily consume a protest and the media's reporting of it. How is conflict created and managed by the protesters in this situation? How did the spokesperson handle the issue of police violence in her interview?
George Bush may have left Australia, but the repercussions of his short visit are still being felt. Red-faced police in Melbourne are trying to explain how 2 protesters foiled the elaborate security to gate-crash the President's lunch, and demonstrators have slated police for what they say was excessive violence.
While President Bush's entourage entered Singapore today with the commentators saying the important business lies ahead, back in Australia, the defeat and frustration lingers. Melbourne police were still trying to play down the international embarrassment of 2 protesters yesterday twice getting past them and the American Secret Service and onto the actual hotel floor of the Bush lunch.
So far as I'm aware, there were 2 people who did get to that floor. That should not have happened, but it did.
It was this couple who enacted every security guard's worst nightmare. They said they didn't want to hurt the President, just to make a point.
If we were dressed in suits or dressed well, we could have sat with the guests, we could have mingled with the guests and done whatever we liked.
And there have been other repercussions from the near riot, which saw police using horses and batons against people protesting against the Bush visit and American foreign policies in general.
We do have people with specialist training. I am reluctant to use those people, but if I have to, then we certainly will.
The protesters say the police provoked them, then went on to seek further vengeance in a hotel later.
They entered the room, hit a number of people. We escaped through the back door. The publican didn't know what to do. He said, "What can I do? I can't call the police. These are the police."
A police internal inquiry is underway on those allegations. The violence in Melbourne yesterday also robbed farmers of the spoils in America of what had been shaping as a good hearing of their grievances over trade.
It happened in Melbourne. About 500 people demonstrated against protectionist US trade policies.
Australian farmers have recoiled in horror at having a vehement coalition of anti-American, pro-abortion and pro-gay rights activists shown as their representatives. National Farmers Federation Executive Director Rick Farley said it was appalling that farmers, who had been complimented for their restraint in demonstrations, should have been portrayed so inaccurately to the whole American public.
What was this protest about? Were the protesters who got into the meeting making a statement about dress standards or something else?
They didn't want to hurt the President, just to make a point.
If we were dressed in suits or dressed well, we could have sat with the guests, we could have mingled with the guests and done whatever we liked.
Do you think these were the only comments they made in this interview? And how could they have handled this interview more effectively? What was the effect of the protesters running down the street? How do you react to the use of force by police? Compare this action with the previous one.
Driver charged after angry clashes with loggers in Far East Gippsland. The first arrests came soon after daybreak on Brown Mountain, 80 kilometres northeast of Orbost.
While more than 100 conservationists rallied in the Virgin Forest, loggers refused to stop working. Protesters tried in vain to blockade the trucks. Ron Fletcher said he was carried for more than a meter on this one and then assaulted, his mask torn off and his equipment smashed. Nothing stopped the sawing, but conservationists claimed at least one tree was saved.
We don't own this planet, we merely borrow it from our children.
All I can say is you're a bloody nuisance.
The contractor leasing 25 hectares of the National Estate Forest from the Victorian government says the protest is costing him $6,000 a day and can't pay his workers.
I've got reason to be here too. I've got a wife and kids to support, and I'm making a living.
1.5 hours later, police arrived.
If you do not leave forthwith, you'll be arrested and charged with trespass. Okay.
And took away as many protesters as they could. For contractor Frank Brunt, that was no victory. His coupe is the next to be logged, and he's expecting trouble tomorrow.
As far as I'm concerned, they're the criminals for not letting the job go ahead and be done properly.
Conservationists are confident their numbers will swell during the week and say they'll stay put until logging in the National Estate stops.
With logging contractors on Brown Mountain.
At first light this morning, about 90 protesters walked into the National Estate Forest. From the start, it was clear police were taking today's demonstration very seriously. Among them was Frank Brunt, the logging contractor whose coupe was the focus of attention.
I request you leave this area, and if you do not do so, you will be trespassing.
But the demonstrators moved on, claiming that as the forest was public land, they should be allowed access to it. Some broke ranks and police immediately closed in. Frank Brunt watched the commotion, disgusted.
They're not people, they're animals.
Once police cleared the coupe, he returned to work. The Victorian government says logging in the National Estate Forest will continue, despite the embarrassment protests may cause the federal government in the lead up to this year's election.
These commitments are required to supply the timber that the people of Victoria require.
Conservationists disagree.
Knock you off, dollar bill!
They say the unprotected forest is as biologically sensitive as the Erranundra National Park 50 metres away, where logging is banned. They plan to protest outside federal government offices on Friday and to continue demonstrations on Brown Mountain.
By contrast, in Victoria, protests continued against the logging of national estate areas in East Gippsland. Belinda Hawkins, who's been covering the forest demonstrations for ABC News, took time out to talk to the families of the loggers and the sawmillers in the region of Bendock. Many of these people have been there for 3 generations or more, and they're fearful that this will be the end of their livelihood and their lifestyle.
They're the ones who...
We don't own this planet, we merely borrow it from our children.
Oh, pump your head in, mate. Don't worry about that.
I know what I'd like to do. I'd like to grab a couple of them bulldozers up there and just push them down over the hill there.
Why do people like that come up and try and interfere with what we're doing? What would you say if Mum bloody dressed like that? That'd be terrible, wouldn't it? You kick her out. Dirty mongrels.
They shouldn't even be on the site. It's too dangerous. They don't realise how dangerous.
Bendock, on the Victoria-New South Wales border, is a long way from anywhere that counts. If you blink, you'll miss it. The only thing that moves here is a pub. The drinkers are sawmillers, loggers and truckies. They're all too aware that they're caught in the crossfire of what promises to be a long battle between conservationists and the Victorian and federal governments. According to the locals, no one is doing the right thing. They say the Victorian government's ban on using logging debris in East Gippsland for wood chipping or anything else means that 1 million cubic metres of timber is left rotting on the forest floor every year.
Like I come from New South Wales, and up there we do pulp. Like we get logs where we can.
As for the conservationists...
They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're doing. They're a pack of weirdos.
Frank Brunt's leasehold is one of 7 in the National Estate Forest, which the Victorian government has opened up for logging this year. He's invested close to $1 million in equipment to cut down and cart away 200-year-old grey gums and messmates. Frank says reforestation will take many years to provide the timber necessary for him to make a living. In the meantime, he's relying on access to trees in the virgin forest. If there are too many demonstrators around, he can't work and winds up losing $4,500 a day in a season that only lasts for a few months in the year.
Yeah, I've been in this game for about 25 years now, but I'm the 3rd generation of the Brunt family. Father and grandfather before, they've been in the bush, that's all I know. Same as my young fella, he's the 4th generation. Well, you know, I'm trying to set up a living for him. How can I do it when we're sitting on the side of the road here being held up by hypocrites, that's all they are. They don't know nothing about any of this timber. They think we're doing the wrong thing. They reckon we're criminals. As far as I'm concerned, they're the criminals for not letting the job go ahead.
Act for the tree. Act for the tree.
Roy Jamieson could soon have a lot more time on his hands. He fears the sawmilling industry he's worked in for almost 70 years is finished.
I can't get it. See, the bloody section's not run in enough for me.
The Jamiesons have been working here for 3 generations. Roy's father started sawmilling when Bendock was a gold rush town. Memories, as well as the family's saws, are part of the heritage that keeps these men in the forests. They know nothing else.
Just sort of in our blood, we love doing it, and make anything out of it. Well, if we do, good luck to us. If we don't, we don't. We'll do nothing else but.
There's no way knowing I'd live down the city, so and it's a fantastic sort of a job, I reckon.
But they say if the protest drags on into next month, their mill may have to shut down.
Actually, the builders, they had put up a house, the carpenters, manufacturers of windows, doors and everything. The whole thing's got to collapse, hasn't it?
It's not if we're actually knocking it all over and that's it. If you go back there 3 or 4 years later on, you'll see a beautiful big stand of regeneration.
That's not how the conservationists see it. And if governments change tack and ban logging in national estate forests, Bendock will become the ghost town it almost is.
These stories contain many emotive images: falling trees, people blocking logging equipment and angry workers. Which images work to the advantage and to the disadvantage of the protesters, and how? How do the theatrical elements of the protest work? Masks, costumes and music, etc. What effect does the scene in the pub have? And why were there so many interviews with loggers and none with protesters? What are your impressions of this action overall?
Protesters' target in Melbourne was the Aeronautics Division of the Federal Defence Department, barricaded at every entrance.
It is a publicity stunt, but it's a necessary one. ADEX is starting next week in Canberra, and it's just totally immoral.
As employees arrived, resistance from demonstrators was met with equal determination.
Pick them up, pick them all up.
There were 16 arrests. The protesters say the exhibition is a military bazaar specifically aimed at Asian Pacific countries, including Indonesia.
Australia sold bullets to Indonesia in the past, and maybe they were the same bullets that we sold to kill innocent people at a peaceful demonstration calling for democracy.
In Canberra, protesters have already drawn the battle lines outside the exhibition centre where the display opens next Tuesday. But the unions are hoping their picket line will ensure there won't be one.
We've called on all affiliates to respect that picket. I would anticipate that there will be no union members cross it, either with transport or any other services.
With more than 1,000 picketers expected from around the country, protest organisers say today's demonstrations were only dress rehearsals.
Before being ejected, but that was only a minor skirmish. Once again, the main action was at the Defence exhibition, which opened this morning with some help from the police.
After 3 days of violent confrontation between police and peace groups, today's opening of ADEX saw tempers flare again. As opening time approached, buyers began to arrive, those on foot forced to run the gauntlet. At other entrances, police were in almost complete control. 7 police were injured, 26 demonstrators arrested, bringing the total to more than 200. The dispute even reached Parliament House, a large group disturbing question time in both houses before several were ejected.
I wish that those demonstrators would themselves keep the peace in accordance with their claimed deep-seated convictions.
It's the most violent confrontation in Canberra since the early 70s, with both sides taking very different views.
I believe that the protesters that are here are essentially on a non-violent mission, and I believe they should be received as such.
I feel terribly concerned that an exhibition as important to Australia's economy and security as this can be disrupted to the extent that it's being disrupted by a group of people that are behaving like thugs and terrorists.
With police gaining the upper hand, the exhibition went ahead on schedule. More than 150 displays, with everything from the latest military hardware to life-saving technology. It was thought this would be the last ADEX to be held in Canberra after the ACT government's decision to block future exhibitions. But organisers say they'll try to keep the event here by holding it on Commonwealth property, such as a military base. If they do, the ACT government has warned it won't be paying for police protection. But with displays at ADEX from the state governments of New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, it appears there'll be no shortage of volunteers to host future exhibitions.
This story contains a lot of aggression from all sides. Which images work best for the protesters here, and which ones work against them? Could the activists have got their message across more effectively? Which of these protests were the most and least effective, do you think, and why? How does media coverage of your campaign compare? What are the strengths and weaknesses of your campaign in terms of media coverage? What discussions have you had about your successes and your failures? What are the elements of direct action under your control that can help you to get your message across more clearly to a TV news audience?